Chapter 16. 49 hours, 15 minutes, 18 seconds before impact. After the Game of War, his secret was out. Almost every engineer on the ship had witnessed it, and all of the crew had heard about it within 2 rotations afterwards. He wasn't certain how secret it had really been to begin with, but the way the crew interacted with him now was in vast contrast to before. Suddenly he found himself being spoken to directly, gestured to, and bombarded by questions almost any time a crew member found themselves with an opportunity, especially the newer ones. He disliked it. Interacting was still a strange process, and it took effort to use the translator and not feel nauseated. As far as he could tell, it was physically altering his brain. Something Dehair had actually laughed at when he had brought it to discussion. "Of course it is. What, did you think you would need to wear that forever?" He did not find that nearly as amusing as she did, but she had reassured him that it was fine. In time the device would dissolve, and any linkages and connections he had made while using it would stick. This had driven him in the nervous habit of speaking English when he was alone. It was the one real link he had to his past that was tangible, and he didn't want to wake up one day and realize it had been replaced. It had kept him away from sleep more than a few times. The one thing that truly did grind at him was why. Why did he think it mattered so much? He couldn't see a clear reason. As far as he could tell, he was the only human left. No one he had spoken to, not even through Yatal's connections, had ever heard of humanity. As far as anyone knew, they didn't exist at all. He supposed that would make sense, considering the Union had probably exterminated them a long time ago. Through talks with Saiza, he had come to understand the history around him, as viewed through the eyes of a young aspiring trader. The young siren had traveled since the day he was born, and had many things to share. Sometimes far too many things to put into a meaningful order, but he meant well. The Union was old, apparently too old to accurately say with certainty exactly how far back it went. Easily hundreds of thousands of years from what was described, but their strange manner of timekeeping didn't help much. Saiza said he was 15 cycles old, and Sonat admitted she was only 17. Apparently for sirens this was very young, and they could live to be over 200 or more. The more he had tried to decipher how this worked, the more confused it left him. The best he could assume, with nothing to compare it to, was that a cycle came to be around a year, or the alien equivalent. It was a personal time, or a rate of time that you specifically have existed. Apparently traveling faster than light could make timekeeping difficult. Regardless, when he had learned about the quarantine and what it was, things started to make much more sense. As far as destruction of the human race, Saiza didn't know a thing, and the man never pressed the issue on the young siren. What Saiza did know, though, was trade. He explained everything from that particular view, from what the lines were to what it meant to the crew. He didn't approach it from a military description, but instead from the perspective of why they were heading near them and how they mattered economically. Apparently, this was of serious importance for a trade ship and crew. If they could make it out here along the fringes, they could make it anywhere. Though the trade aspects of these things didn't seem relevant at first, it put the pieces of the puzzle together for him rather quickly. It seemed that humanity had the ill luck of being on the wrong side of the galactic fence. The side with the cancer-like planet-killing infection. It wasn't much of a jump from there to understand why they had been removed. Humans had broken the line protecting trillions of individuals, and a giant galactic bureaucracy had overreacted. Honestly, if he looked at it from the other side and stood in their shoes, he could almost comprehend why they had done it. But he couldn't forgive it. Certainly, the needs of many would outweigh the needs of a few, but he could never understand the cruelty and fear required to do something so terrible, and then to simply let it be forgotten, washed away by the sands of time. It was as if his people had never even existed. He couldn't understand if he wanted revenge or if he just wanted closure. Everyone who had been involved in the whole affair was likely dead and gone a long time ago, and there were just too many things coming at him at once. Trying to make sense of it all was just painful. There was no true way to deal with it. He had always felt that way about loss. He had lost many before, and now he knew he'd lost again. Even his memories were faded. Of those, some he had gotten back, and they ran at him with tiny tremors of recognition and knowing. Still, some were likely gone forever, wisped away like photons into the black. It hurt to accept it. He had lived, laughed, and loved, but he didn't remember who these things had been with. He only knew that they had been everything that mattered. That was how he often found himself walking the ship when most of the crew was asleep. In the depths below, he paced the halls quietly, singing songs he could barely remember, in a language long dead, from a species that no one knew existed. If I could start again, 1,000,000 miles away, I would keep myself, I would find a way. 27 hours, 32 minutes, 59 seconds before impact. Juuso Trohan was what he called himself, but the first title was far more than sufficient, and the secondary was simply related to his familiar sect, and one of many. He had yet to earn it. When he had left his homeworld, one of the many colonies that stood near the fringes, he had hoped for glory. It was a foolish dream, but not an uncommon one for a young Rula buck. He had trained among the guard and worked as a soldier. When he felt this was not enough, he pushed himself farther from home and became a mercenary. After cycles of this, he realized he had reached the edge of the fringe. So he enlisted himself to be a protector along the lines. It was the single stupidest thing he had ever done in his life. If he hadn't been in the good fortune of ending up in the 33rd Division, Juuso knew he would be dead. If he ever met any from the 33rd again, he would hang his head and claws in shame before them. He had no honor in that regard any longer. He was a coward. He had left their sacred duty and kinship to hide behind them in the safety they provided, to reap the benefits of others who would live and die for him while he ran. Tainted honor. If one found themselves with it, their only choice was to focus on improving by other means or facing it directly. He had come to serve under Yatal to earn some semblance of honor in her shadow, as she fearlessly led them to support the lines. That was a path to redemption, if there truly was any path at all. Yatal was strong, and she bore the marks to prove it. Though not a Rula vessel, there was an honor code aboard this ship. With it, the shipmaster drew others like the stars that gathered systems around them. Still, some of those others were not what Juuso had come to expect. His new crew, and in essence his new pack, was fragile and weak. The sirens of the crew were not warriors, and only a few bore scars. Without a doubt, many held the gaze of veterans, but he could find no true proof or the evidence. The most frustrating of them all was his crew leader, Diher. For some reason, the beast guarded her as closely as the shipmaster's young, though Juuso could find no explanation as to why. It had gotten to the point where he was tempted to ask the creature. He, as well as the other newer crew, had come to terms with the fact that it was intelligent. As Juuso wandered in the dark, he grew more frustrated with every rounded corner. Originally, he had been trying to follow Chkrobh, but he had quickly gotten lost in the underbelly of the ship, and now found himself traveling aimlessly. He was concerned for his crewmate, and feared that the Oxot was suffering from something that he, as a Rula, could not fully understand. Still, that didn't make it any less dangerous for Chkrobh, who was certainly showing signs of insomnia and delusion. It was a known point of honor to protect those around you, even from themselves, but in this situation it seemed as though Juuso had simply wasted his time. Try as he might, the Oxot had lost him entirely when it let its camouflage take over and merged into the shadows. Now he was the same as an adolescent from his home colony, lost foolishly in the woods on a true night. Scrap metal and empty rooms lay around him, and no clear means of exit had presented themselves. He let his claws lay still on the cold metal of the hall floor, and he listened. For some reason, he felt the uncomfortable twitch of danger tugging at his senses. There was some factor of difference from before and now. As he stilled his breath, taking in extra air with his vocal lungs, he held in wait. It was distant and unfamiliar, but somewhere in the black, there was a voice. Slowly, Juuso came to approach it. It wasn't a siren. That had become clear as his translator failed to interpret the meanings of the strange sounds which echoed throughout the dark halls, haunting and clear. The light seemed to grow, and the shadows dimmed with each corner he walked. His frustration and his anger were forgotten now, replaced by something he had not felt in a long time: wonder. Music from other species was rare, if not just unheard of. Most that existed was kept in a cultural manner, not shared with those on the outside. Many species simply lacked the concept entirely, but here it was, unmistakably foreign and real, a deep sound that rang through the empty spaces around him. Sirens had a language which was song-like in quality, but it was said that they didn't sing for pleasure. Juuso couldn't understand a single word, and no matter how clearly he listened, the meanings escaped him. His translator simply didn't know what it was trying to interpret. So when he walked around the final corner, the air he had trapped released in a long exhalation of surprise. It wasn't a siren at all. It was the beast. The strange music stopped the instant he had stepped into sight, and the creature that turned to face him drew its brows together. The human was sitting against the rounded wall of the corridor, leaning back with its head slightly angled towards the surprised Rula. Juuso was always amazed by how much other species could draw emotion and intent on facial posturing. Rula had always relied more on body language as a whole. In a small dip of his secondary limbs and a nod of his head, Juuso stepped into the small section of functioning light to join the human. Hopefully, the courtesy would be enough to permit his unexpected intrusion. "I didn't expect anyone else to be down here." The man's voice broke the quiet air. "You should go back to the upper levels before you find yourself lost." Juuso held his ground, debating the approach of eye contact. For some species, this would be interpreted as a challenge. For others, a sign of respect. Making his decision, the Rula lifted his head to meet the human's gaze. "I was following the Oxot, Chkrobh. He is not well." "The chameleon?" Juuso blinked in confusion as his translator failed him yet again. "Yes, perhaps." "He is fine. I have spoken with him not long ago." Juuso blinked again, and then stood awkwardly as the human held its stare back at him. He tried to hide his relaxing posture as the ship beast finally broke the gaze to push itself up onto its two legs. This was going much better than their last encounter. As if seizing the strangeness of the situation, the human asked a question that threw whatever guard Juuso had mentally established. "What the hell are you?" It was an absurd question. Rula were everywhere in the galaxy, from the lines to the inner systems to the fringes. For someone to have lived their lives and never seen one bordered on impossibility. Perhaps Juuso's temper was still smoldering quietly in the background, or perhaps his assumption that the question had just been asked in an incredibly rude manner had fanned those flames. "I'm a fracking Rula! What in all of the void are you?" Juuso had just enough time to realize how stupid he had just been before the human showed its teeth. He was disturbed at how many of them it had. 2 sets of angular pointed ones seemed to catch the light in a way that only hardened enamel layers could, and those were not alone. If he had ever wondered if the ship beast was a meat-eater, even in the slightest, it was gone now. Sharp barks seemed to issue from its throat, and it threw back its head as its chest heaved, before it brought its eyes level with Juuso's once more. Its teeth now only slightly visible, in a strange gesture he had often seen when the beast was near Yatal. "I suppose that is the question, isn't it? I've been asking it myself quite a bit." The human turned and began to walk as Juuso followed quietly. Am I the last of my kind, a relic to the ages? Several popping sounds ricocheted through the halls as the human flexed its arms. Or did they survive, somewhere out there in the black, and I'm simply ignorant of it? The human trailed off as silence became eerier, and the darkness closed in around them. Without my people, my culture, their beliefs, what am I? A guardian? A weapon? Or... The human spun on Juuso so quickly the Rula didn't even have time to fully raise up its second set of limbs in response before the human's nose was barely 1/10 of a unit from his face. Am I simply a beast? Juuso tried not to shudder. His mental warning of danger was simply a shrill screeching in the back of his mind, so loudly it overwhelmed everything. Without a doubt, this was the single most dangerous individual he had ever encountered in his entire life. "What do you want from me?" The words rolled out slowly as Juuso tried to maintain some semblance of composure. Angry white eyes with small spheres of color that stared back with rage. There could be no misinterpretation now. A Rula knew body language. "I simply want you to understand something." Juuso slowly lowered back to the ground as the human turned away and walked off into the darkness. If there is any true reason this ship and its crew still exist, it isn't because of Yatal. It's because of Dehair. As the sounds of the human's footsteps grew quieter in the distance, one more statement echoed through the halls to reach him. "If you harm her, I will kill you." 12 hours, 16 minutes, 39 seconds before impact. Washroom duty was easily the worst job on the ship. Unlike the competitor roles which fought for that title, washroom duty wasn't difficult or frustrating. It was simply humiliating. Nothing made Sonat more angry than humiliation. The human was with her this shift, but it wasn't helping. It was acting out its role as a casual observer from its chosen resting spot, one of the few benches Sonat had managed to scrub clean this rotation. As always, it wasn't speaking, and in typical fashion, the thing wasn't even paying attention to her as she struggled with the fiber brush along the slick floor. Sonat wasn't certain if this made the whole situation worse, or if she was just so angry that she would find anyone at all to be irritating. As the brush slipped out of her hands, causing her to fall forward on the partially scrubbed surface, she let out a note of rage. She had enough of this for one lifetime, and probably a little extra. The worst part was that Sonat knew for a fact Yatal had purchased 2 cleaner bots for this very purpose, but persistently stuck to the lie that they had gone missing. That didn't even make logical sense. They were in space, contained within a thick hull and an environment shield. Things don't generally up and leave to go somewhere else. Still, here she was, a prodigal genius, scrubbing floors. She was going to get back at Yatel for this somehow. Of that Sonat was utterly certain. It wasn't as though the patches looked bad on the ship anyways. Sonat felt they brought something of an artistic beauty to the ugly freighter. Void only knew the vessel needed it. The gigantic gray block they all called home wasn't exactly out to win any awards based on looks, though perhaps on carrying capacity. Sonat knew there was easily 3 times the space below deck when compared to the inhabited upper levels, which put it into the class of a heavy civilian vessel. There weren't very many of those around. Several crew members walked past the open doors of the washrooms, their murmurs reaching her ears in tiny clips of conversation. Though not enough to tell exactly what their conversations were about, Sonat felt fairly certain some of them were speaking about her. Humiliating! Yatel was going to pay for this. As the rotation passed, Sonat finally cleared the room, leaving it spotless. She might hate it, but she wasn't going to leave a job incomplete. That was something Saiza would do. She liked to think she was of a higher quality than her sibling, at least in this regard. Flicking her tail in signal at her inattentive guardian, Sonat left for halls. The human got up to follow her, but stopped at a fork in the halls before wandering off in the opposite direction, towards the bridge. Sonat was constantly trying to understand the human's motives, but never could make sense of the thing. It listened to Yatel and obeyed her orders for the most part, but it didn't seem to prioritize them. It completely ignored the rest of the crew, for the exception of herself, Saiza, and, strangely enough, Diher. Apparently, the medical officer had been the first of them to encounter the human when it broke free during the raid. She had been with one of the stewards, who apparently hadn't survived. Diher didn't talk much about that when Sonat had asked her. From what the other surviving crew had said, the human had carried her on its back the rest of the way, through the entire ship, until it reached the bridge. Sonat was beginning to suspect that Diher had unintentionally life-bonded the creature. Stranger things had certainly happened when one of their kind was close to death, though typically such actions were reserved for another of their own species. As unlikely as it was, it would explain a lot. It wasn't as though such a thing was easy to do in any case. Yatel had only partially done it, if at all, and she had been using a training collar as motivation. From Sonat's view, if there was any lasting mental link between the human and the shipmaster, it was a small one. Yatel and the human had certainly agreed to some contract, but neither were openly speaking about it. All that left Sonat was speculation, and it was driving her crazy. There was too much of that going on. Problem-solving was what she did. Work out the known factors and variables, put them together, and get a meaningful result. The problem was that she didn't know anything. While she was stuck cleaning floors, Yatel and the bridge crew were probably still trying to figure out how their hull magically resealed itself. There was a problem that could take her mind off of the human enigma they called a ship guardian. On the bright side of things, Sonat was still a genius, and she had a reasonable hypothesis on the whole affair. Reasonable as in she was already 99% certain of it, and now just had to figure out a way to prove it. 1 hour, 57 minutes, 19 seconds before impact. Saiza wasn't thrilled with this. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the least thrilled, well, he was a solid 14 at this point. Stalking through the ship underbelly when all the systems down here were set on standby was horribly creepy. There was barely any light. Every step he took seemed to echo off into the distance, and occasionally he would hear strange, inexplicable noises. Saiza cursed his luck, and his sister, equally. A bet was a bet, though, and that ship had sailed. He knew Sonat had played him the moment he tried to call her bluff and she pulled out a military combat shielding suit. It was brand new, fully loaded with the required tech, passive environment controls, and a 2-rotation life support system. Where she had gotten it, he could only guess, but he was fairly certain he was now wearing stolen military equipment. Probably the same equipment that they had been hired to transport. He sincerely hoped he was wrong about that. Union federal crimes not considered, if Yatal caught them this time, cleaning the washrooms was the least of their worries. To her credit, Sonat had been thorough with her plan. Their ever-watchful bodyguard was on an engineering shift helping Diher, and Yatal was manning the bridge as they approached their landing point. That gave them a tiny window of opportunity for Sonat's crazy scheme. It wasn't hard to miss either, as the weirdness that seemed to associate with deceleration was prevalent anywhere one could go on the ship. That made keeping track of time a lot easier for Saiza, but even if that hadn't been enough, Sonat had programmed a countdown in on his HUD screen. Saiza called the whole thing a scheme, but he honestly wasn't even sure what he was doing. He was just following instructions over the comm system and hoping he could keep the suit. If it wasn't stolen, of course. His scanners were live feeding information to Sonat back in their quarters, who was tracking his progress with a holomap and a 3-dimension progression screen. "Check every room and don't waste time," she says. Saiza growled an angry hum as he kept up his brisk pace, pausing only slightly to illuminate each room with his helmet lights before heading down the hall to the next. Hopefully she wasn't paying attention to audio. As his survey of the ship continued, Saiza began to slow down. The ship deceleration was tangible in more ways than one, and he was getting tired of running. His tail, also covered by the strange material of the combat suit, swished with each panting breath as he turned yet another corner to check yet another room. It seemed that the ship was endless. This room, though, unlike many of the others, was filled with scrap, and not cargo. Hundreds of parts lay strewn about the place, and hundreds more were piled underneath those. As Saiza slowly brought his lights over them, his comm system buzzed to life with a hiss when the light fell on 2 bizarre-looking cleaning bots. "I fracking knew we had those!" Saiza jumped in response as Sonat's voice cut in, as though she was standing right next to him. "Try and turn those things on, see if they work." Grateful for any excuse to catch his breath, Saiza approached the droids with a mild reluctance. One of these things had run over his tail on a trip when he was younger. He wasn't specifically fond of the things. "Was this what we were looking for?" He laid his hand on the first of the pair as he brought his lights down to focus on the holoscreen that greeted him. "I didn't think this was the type of thing you were going to go through so much effort for." A loud crash from behind the cleaning bots brought his attention up, and he jumped back, bringing his lights and live feed back to the front. His right hand crept down towards the light pistol at his hip as his tail straightened for balance. In the piles of junk that were scattered out in the back of the room, something was moving. "Sonat, what did you send me into?" The tip of his tail was twitching with panic as he carefully stepped backwards. "Relax, Saiza. I'm fairly sure that it probably isn't dangerous." With that, he drew his weapon and continued to back towards the hall. As he passed through the threshold of the room and back into the hall, the heavy containment doors slammed down. The thick metal went whizzing past his face by barely a micro-unit. His comms buzzed to life yet again, and he heard that familiar voice chuckling. "That was just in case I'm wrong." The chuckling stopped abruptly as a giant dent appeared in the door. "You're definitely wrong, Sonat." For some reason, Saiza didn't find that statement nearly as satisfying as he always imagined it would be. 0 hours, 9 minutes, 3 seconds before impact. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was falling. The nervous looks from the engineers signaled that they felt likewise. From the monitoring station in the room outside the reactors, Diher was singing out readings for the 2 Mintrox who were fiddling with a number of devices in a panicked frenzy. From what he could gather, their thrusters were effectively shut off, and their shields were set to burnout. Tremors shook the floor, and the Oxot working with the coil reel flashed a variety of colors as the rig spit out a flurry of sparks. In the far back of his mind, he felt a flash of pain as the ship shook more violently, and then another. The sensation wasn't good, whatever it was. Signaling to Diher, he set off down the halls at a sprint, trying his best to keep balance as the ship shifted beneath him. He only made it halfway to the bridge before turning a sharp corner and smashed into Siza, who had been coming from the opposite side of the fork, knocking the unlucky siren flying across the hall. The feeling of dread made his blood run cold. He had just tackled a child at full speed into a metal wall. That was enough to liquefy the raiders who had tried to take the ship previously. He could only imagine what it would do to an adolescent siren. Then, as though he hadn't almost become jelly, Siza got up and kept running, all while screaming a warning. "Don't turn around! Don't turn around!" Curiosity got the better of him, and he found that there was a giant fucking robot stampeding down the hallway. Sonat had miscalculated. She had to accept that these things did happen from time to time, but she had always planned for the worst. Siza did have the top-of-the-line military shielding unit, so hopefully her miscalculation wasn't a fatal one. The issue now, really, was what to do about the rampaging murder bot that was crashing through the halls outside, or decide if all of this was actually irrelevant, as she could feel the horrible sensation of freefall welling up around her. From what sensors she had access to in her quarters, it definitely seemed as though they were entering an atmosphere of some kind, but that didn't make much sense. They were scheduled to deliver to an orbital platform, not a surface base. As fantastic a pilot as Yatal was, she had never been very lucky when it came to steering this brick of a ship in atmosphere. She had never been a very good pilot when she was unconscious, either. A check of the bridge live feed cleared that mystery up. It was a total mess in there. Sonat shut out the fear as soon as she noticed the blood. Now wasn't the time. Tapping into the ship's comm station, Sonat took command. "All crew, attention! All crew! Strap into something immediately. We are in an emergency descent." She set that to an audio loop and checked the bridge again. She couldn't control anything from here, but she could zoom the scanners to read the holopads in the room and figure out what was happening. She tried her best to ignore the other feeds, in which Siza and the human were running for their lives from a death machine. It seemed even the human couldn't deal with something that dangerous, but it could run extremely quickly. They were heading down on the planet that their platform destination should be orbiting, but from what she could make out of the main screen that had been pulled up, it wasn't there any longer. It also read multiple incoming projectiles, and a manual override had forced all available power into the shielding. She had to hand it to Yatal on this one. Her mother certainly had some guts. As Sonat pulled up a monitor to check on the duo's progress, she saw that the human had picked Siza up and thrown him over its shoulder as the creature continued its dead sprint. Siza, meanwhile, was trying his best to shoot at the thing behind them with his pistol. She knew that she probably shouldn't find this as funny as she did. Sealing 2 sets of doors in the next fork they passed through, and then sealing all the others on the ship as well for good measure, would likely be enough to buy them some time. Sonat reopened the doors in the most direct path to the bridge. Siza was going to have to try and land this thing. That seemed to be their only option left. As the heavy doors sealed behind them, the human dropped Siza down on the bridge floor before falling on his back and panting with exhaustion. Whatever that thing was, he hoped that the numerous sealed gates would slow it down. Rolling on his side and slowing his breathing to keep the lightheaded sensation at bay, he checked the room. The crew on staff was in a panic. Several of them had managed to strap into their chairs, but several more were unconscious, thrown across the ground with each new shudder of the vessel. One by one, he picked them up and strapped them into the nearest seats. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Yatal had been on shift here, if he remembered correctly. As he finished clicking in the last injured crew member he could find on the lower level, he headed up to the elevated stage of the command platform with a nod to the few crew still actively attempting to keep the ship under control. The shipmaster wasn't in good shape. Siza had propped her up against the wall, but she had a gash along her scalp, and her mane was coated in blood. Her breaths were shallow and quick, but her eyes were lucid. Quiet orders sang out in quick time, instructions he couldn't quite hear. Siza scrambled back away from her and ran to her seat before strapping himself in. The little one was in charge now. Hollow screens floated around the chair, adjusting to his size in a strange encapsulating bubble of information and controls. Just like that, he was immersed. As the man watched from Yatel's side, he felt the hair on his arms and neck begin to rise. The kid was about to make or break the whole thing. It was all on him. A crash shook the main doors on the bridge, and a gigantic dent appeared in the center. Another, and then another followed, before metallic claws appeared at the seal, prying at heavy alloy. It seemed this was it, then. Siza had his job. The ship beast had its own. With a grunt, he pulled his weapon from its perch on the wall. A sword wasn't going to be much good against something made of metal, but it was better than his fists. The wicked curved point reflected the light from the hundreds of screens and illuminations behind him as he raised it out in front of his chest. That familiar feeling was back. Taking position in front of the door, he felt the tremors as the metal shifted under the tremendous force to slowly edge the doors apart. He let his fingers curl around the grip and respected the cool synthetic material that held the tang. He felt the familiar quickening take over as he tasted the rich atmosphere of the ship with each deep inhalation. Colors started to heighten, and he felt his feet brace themselves against the floor. This was where the stand was made. Just like the one before it, he wasn't going to simply wait and take what was coming for him. That wasn't how things worked here, despite the circumstances. That was a choice. This was his crew, his family, his home, and he would be damned if he let that thing take a single step closer. As the doors finally burst open, he charged. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 42 seconds before impact.